Welcome to the Everyday Warrior podcast, where we talk free to break free. As someone who's been told they talk too much, can speak with a mouthful of marbles, and might just be able to sell ice to Eskimos, I have found the perfect space to speak my truth and dive into deep conversations. This podcast is about celebrating everyday warriors, the people who face life's challenges head on, breaking through obstacles to build resilience, strength, and courage. Join me, your host, Trudy Marie, as I sit down with inspiring individuals who have fought their own battles and emerged stronger, sharing raw, real, and authentic stories that make you laugh, cry, debate, wonder, intrigue, feel all the emotions, and get curious about life with. This is a safe space to explore, question, and find your own path to new possibilities. Let us all embrace the warrior within and realise that while no one is walking in your shoes, others are on the same path, journeying through life together. Please note that the following podcast may contain discussions or topics that could be triggering or distressing for some listeners. I aim to provide informative and supportive content, but understand that certain themes may evoke strong emotions or memories. If you find yourself feeling overwhelmed or in need of support while listening, I encourage you to pause the podcast and take a break. Remember that it is okay to prioritise your well-being and seek assistance from trained professionals. There is no shame in this. In fact, it is the first brave step to healing. If you require immediate support, please consider reaching out to Lifeline on 13 11 14 or a crisis intervention service in your area. Thank you for listening, and please take care of yourself as you engage with the content of this podcast. Love the Everyday Warriors podcast? You can support the show for as little as $5 with a one-time donation or by becoming a monthly subscriber. Your contribution helps me continue bringing you inspiring stories of everyday warriors who overcome challenges to find strength, resilience, and new possibilities in life. Head to the link to buy me a coffee and fuel the next episode. Every bit counts. If you're looking for an inspiring story of resilience, healing, and rediscovering yourself, my book, Everyday Warrior, is for you. It's my memoir of hiking the 1,000-kilometre Bibbulmun track, a journey that was as much about finding my way back to myself as it was about conquering the trail. Through the highs, lows, and everything in between, this book shares my raw and honest experience of overcoming trauma and embracing the strength within. Grab your copy now. Just head to the link in the show notes and let's take this journey together. Welcome to another episode of the Everyday Warriors podcast, and today is another solo episode from yours truly, and it is part 5 of my 8-part series talking about my time with WA Police. And today I'm going to talk to you about my time at Bayswater Police Station. Now, as the project was coming to an end, it was time for me to find a new location, and this was a really big thing for me because, yes, I'd come off probation by going to the project, but now it was time for me to determine where I would be spending possibly the next 2 years of my career, because WA Police had a minimum 2-year tenure policy. So I needed to do some research into which particular stations I wanted to go to. Now, while I was at the project, WA Police changed its structure. So instead of being that response and local policing teams like it was when I was at Northwest Metro Response, it had changed to be all policing done from the individual stations. So that meant I had to pick a particular station that I wanted to go to. Now, I knew I wanted a position somewhere in the northern suburbs of Perth because I didn't want to go too far away because of my children and their schooling. I didn't want a lot of travel time. I didn't want to go back to Mirrabooka because I'd already been at that station. So I decided in the process of elimination to go to Bayswater. I knew it was a very busy station. The suburbs that it serviced were inside the sort of city centre, and it was a highly built up area. I also heard that the senior sergeant at that particular station ran a very tight ship, and I believed that I could learn a lot from my time there. So I applied for that position and got that position. I didn't immediately start there on my beginning date that was anticipated after my transfer came through. The reason being is that at the time I was training for the police games, which that year was going to be held in Perth, and I was going to be playing netball. And so I'd been training by playing with a local team with my sister. And I finished work on the Friday at the project, and I was due to start because of the team I was allocated to. I was supposed to start on the Wednesday. So I had that time off in between. But on the Saturday, I played this game of netball, and in that game, I tore my Achilles. I didn't know at that particular time. I felt the crack on the back of my leg. I went down like a bag of potatoes. I had no idea what was going on, couldn't finish the game. I ended up being taken by a wheelchair down to the first aid centre, and they just said it could have been a strain. Definitely wasn't a strain. And anyway, on the Monday, I went and saw my chiropractor, who referred me immediately to a surgeon. And I managed to get into that surgeon straight away because of the referral. And my appointment with him was on the Tuesday after I'd been for an MRI. So lo and behold, I'd torn my Achilles, and he decided not to operate because I still had a 10% connection of the tendon. So he wanted to do it the slow way, which was actually heal within a moon boot. So it meant that I would have a minimum of 8 weeks in a moon boot, and then I would have obviously recovery physio and everything after that. I was like, this is awesome. Not. So I ended up in a moon boot, on crutches, walking into my new station on the Tuesday to meet my new OIC, Senior Sergeant, with a doctor's certificate telling him I was not going to be at work anytime soon. That was not a fun experience, because the last thing you want to do is let your team down, let the new station down, and be in this situation. However, the senior sergeant was brilliant. He was super understanding. And I think the one thing that saved me is that when I went in, I happened to have on tracky pants and a jumper. I was wearing a West Coast Eagles jumper. The senior sergeant was a one-eyed West Coast Eagles supporter. So I got on his good side for that alone. Now, this was a really difficult time for me in the sense that I felt so lonely and isolated. I didn't know my new team. I hadn't even met them yet because they weren't on duty when I went in, because they weren't starting till the Wednesday. I had lost pretty much contact with the people from the project because I was no longer on the project, so they weren't expecting to hear from me, and I hadn't made any great friends that I would communicate with outside of work. And because I didn't know anybody kind of in that situation, I felt really disconnected and no one checked on me. I mean, health and welfare gave you those calls that were like, for me, a tick and flick sheet. Hi, how are you going? Do you need any help? No? Okay, you're good. Thanks, we've called you. Bye. And that's honestly how it felt for me. So if it hadn't been for a personal development program that I was involved in at the time, that I was coaching on, that I actually had something to fulfill my days and look forward to and keep me motivated. We also finished building our house at the time, so I was able to move in there and, decorate the best you could, given that I was in a moon boot. But it was a really difficult time. After that, I eventually started work. Now, as things happen, the universe, somehow protects you. While I was on that leave, my team had to attend a multiple homicide where children were involved. In fact, they were the first responders and first on scene that then had to declare a protected area while homicide detectives came to the job. Now, my belief is that I was protected from having to attend that, because while I developed, obviously, PTS later on in life, as people who know me know that that's what happened, I think that situation possibly could have broken me, because whoever wants to walk into that situation, and as I'm a very empathic person, I tend to feel things quite a bit, that would have rocked me to my core. So I really think that tearing my Achilles was a blessing in disguise. Now, coming back to work, I was non-operational for a period of time because I wasn't fit to go out on duty. So that meant that I was station bound, literally working the desk and doing front counter inquiries, taking witness statements, doing some behind the scenes admin stuff that needed to be done. But what that meant is that because I worked predominantly day shift, and I didn't have to work the afternoon rosters, I got to work with the other teams. So I got to work with the different people within the station. I got to learn new investigative skills because I'd been working frontline response. I'd never done really any of the back admin investigative stuff on the job. So that was a really cool time for me to actually start to learn the old style of local area policing, the inquiry side of things, and learn all those skills. My sergeant was a great leader for me. He was a detective turned sergeant, and for those who don't know how WA Police works, in most cases, if you are promoted in rank to sergeant and you are a detective, you do have to go back to uniform for a certain period of time before you can apply for a detective sergeant role. I knew that I would have a lot to learn from him using those investigative skills because he would teach me. My team was also awesome. I was the oldest person on the team, but I was also the most junior ranked. And everybody had something to teach me, whether it was about the job or about myself. Like, I absolutely loved my team. They were just a cool bunch of people who we all got along really, really well. And I didn't have a problem working with any of them, because every time I went out on shift, I felt like I was going to learn something new and that they would have my back, most importantly. We were a pretty tight crew in the sense that when we had the crossover shifts, we would regularly go to breakfast or dinner to catch up and have a team meeting on those particular days. So that was kind of like in your rotating roster, there was one breakfast crossover shift and one evening dinner crossover shift per month or per 4 weeks. So that would happen. And then we would regularly have catch up for drinks on, say, every couple of roster shifts. So once every 6 to 8 weeks, I suppose. And that was great for team building because you got to understand and know people outside of the uniform, what they were going on with their lives. It was just a really great time that I had with those people. I mean, some of them even attended my wedding while the rest of them kind of had to work, unfortunately. However, we worked in a sister team, so you would always be on day shift with a team and afternoon shift with a team. So it was called your sister team. But there was one particular guy on my sister team who literally was a bully. He tried to intimidate me. He tried to pull rank, even though he was only a first class. He just got on my nerves because every time he would just try to gaslight me and make me feel like I didn't know what I was doing. However, where I could, I would put him in his place. I would not stand for that type of behaviour. I would stand up to him. I would give it back to him. Because I was like, you know what? No, I don't have to put up with this shit. You don't get to do this to me at my place of work. It's not happening. But it was never to the point that I would have to take action to a higher ranking person, one of the 2 team sergeants. It was always just that niggling, get in your face, gaslight, pain in the ass kind of behaviour that I just had to stand my ground with. During my time there, I also had to learn from my role on the project as it came into play on numerous occasions. I was often asked by the OIC to clarify some recording of incidents. Now, let me tell you, it pissed a few people off in the station, especially those sort of first class and senior connies who thought they knew better and didn't want to hear from a, relatively new constable. However, that was just part and parcel of the job. I'd come out of a project where I literally trained on it and I worked on this full time for 6 months. So I knew more than them in that particular situation. And it really helped clarify my understanding of what I'd been doing, putting it into practice in an everyday situation. And I really valued that the OAC took on what I had to say because I knew what I was doing and what I was talking about in those instances. Some of the highlights and lowlights from my time at that station I'll go into now. Now, they're in no particular order. They're just going to be what I reflect on and what I remember. So one of the things that I really got to know and understand during this time, especially because of my team sergeant and the proactiveness of my team. We had some really great guys who were gung-ho at being proactive with some intel and data that we would get to do some really cool stuff, especially when it came to dealing with drugs and warrants and drug fines. I learned a lot. And as I said, going back to the booze bus days, I was naive as they come when it came to things like drugs. But I learnt so much on the job where you actually are in that position, not just on the booze bus where you're finding it in a car, but actually searching people and going to people's houses and doing warrants and learning where to look for shit. Like, it blew my mind. Like, I will not lie. Like, I was often just like, wow, I'm so sheltered when it comes to this kind of thing. Like, I really did not get what sort of shit people got up to. Even doing my first warrant, like I had multiple dealings with the same person just through different incidents I was going to. I started to get a little bit of intel as I built kind of a rapport with this person, having regular dealings with them. And I ended up having enough intel to be able to get a warrant. Now, that particular warrant, while it ran beautifully and I was commended by my sergeant for doing a really good first warrant, we were unlucky to not really get a big fine. Unfortunately, we got the person in between buy, sell, whatever, and we only found some little incidental stuff, which was disappointing in a way, but at the same time, I really felt good getting that first warrant under my belt. Seeing the things in real life, like not knowing the certain terminology of drugs, but then finding the drugs and learning about it, or how things operated, or what people did to avoid being seen. And there is just so much to that underworld that the everyday person has no clue about. It just, honestly, it blew my mind. I also remembered during that time, like speaking of drugs, where we were dealing with a person who was drug induced and he needed to be cleared for holding. So whenever you arrest somebody, if there is any sign of medical condition, you must get a clearance from a doctor or the hospital to be able to hold them at the lockup. So we had to take this particular person to hospital, and that was my first dealing with an assault police officer because he kicked and spat at me while we were in the hospital. Even though it was low key and not a big deal, it still had to be dealt with by another member of my team had to come and deal with it because you can't do your own incident report for an assault PO. So that was kind of like, oh wow, we can really be in dangerous situations here. Like, this is a note to me to make sure that I'm safe at all times, regardless of whether we're in a hospital or not. Like, you need to look out for number one. I also remember getting a little bit of flack or dealing with sort of sexual harassment things from my sergeant at the time, mainly due to derogatory comments made about my daughter. And I just didn't stand for it. And again, I stood up to him and I said, this is not the type of behaviour that's warranted. Like, this is my daughter you're talking about. This is not welcome behaviour. And if you take it any further or continue to do it, I will take it further. And I gained a lot of respect for him for that. Like, he apologised profusely for crossing the line. And I tolerate a lot. Like, I grew up in the goldfields. I grew up around, knowing the skimpy bar life, the prostitution life, in like seeing what played out. So I wasn't naive in that sort of thing. However, there is a line that you will tolerate and there is a line that can be crossed. And when it comes to bullying and harassment, that's probably the biggest thing, is that people say, oh, it's just a joke, or it's like, I didn't mean it in that way. Well, no, it becomes bullying and harassment when the behaviour continues and it's unwarranted. So you really do need to speak up. And I felt proud of myself in that situation because I felt like I wasn't protecting just me. I was also protecting my daughter. At the same time, I also got my first complaint from a victim of an incident who made a formal complaint because I cared too much. I disclosed a little bit too much information about myself, all in the aim of protecting her and making her safe and trying to get her the help that she required. She didn't like that at all. She wanted to stay with her partner despite the domestic violence situation. And so she decided to take her revenge and make a formal complaint about me. I was very lucky in that situation that it was such a minor incident and that I had all the documentation there. But one thing it made me realise, and one thing that the investigating sergeant did say to me, was be very, very careful of what you say, how you say it, and who you say it to. So that did put my walls up a little bit as to how I would behave with certain victims, certain witnesses, even certain suspects, because I didn't want to put myself in that situation again. I also became a trainer or a presenter for the nationally run Think You Know program, which is basically aimed at cyber safety. It was facilitated with some training that representatives from each station were required to attend, and I was extremely grateful that I was selected by my OIC. Now, I think he did that for a number of reasons. One, I'd come off the project, so I was used to presenting. Two, I was a mother of teenagers, and so I had that. I think he sort of thought, well, if there's going to be one person who's right for this job, it's Trudy. And so I became a regular in my district, of the Bayswater district, of attending schools and delivering that training. And I had a lot of fun with that because it is a really serious topic in the sense that we need to protect our youth and make them understand and be aware of the danger of what can happen online. In my head, if I can just make these kids realise that sometimes it's safer staying a child for longer than it is trying to be an adult, then we could really make a difference in these kids' lives, especially with the way social media has become today. I continue to deliver that training throughout my career moving forward. I also got the opportunity to work at the Royal Show over multiple days because no one likes working the Royal Show. Most coppers I know want to go and fight crime, whereas for me, I loved the community policing side of it. So the idea of not going and locking up baddies and actually going out where families were and having fun and just making sure the population stayed safe in general, that just appealed to me. So I got to do multiple days at the Royal Show, had an absolute ball, great to meet other new officers and people that you wouldn't normally work with. And I even got to, for some reason, my team, there was like you'd walk around in teams of two, and our team was called back this one particular day to the base, and we were told that we were going to be going around with the inspector of the area talking about the Royal Show, and we were going to be on TV. And I was like, awesome, not. But anyway, I took advantage of that. I had a lot of fun with it. I got to be on TV. I got to have a joke with the camera crew and the presenter. And it ended up costing me a carton because when I got back to the station, all my team had obviously seen it the night before on TV. And yeah, I was out of pocket for embarrassing everybody. But, you know, it is what it is. I had a lot of fun. I also got to work a number of voluntary recall to duties, so VRDs, which is where you got the opportunity to work at different events that you had to volunteer for. And I got to work at the Melbourne Cup at Ascot Racecourse. I got to work multiple football matches at Optus Stadium. And I also did Australia Day on the banks of the Swan River. I think for me, I was very lucky in working multiple events like this because I was a female. And at every event, you always need like numbers of females at those events. So I think the fact that I volunteered at every opportunity I got, that I was lucky to snag those particular events. And they were always a good learning opportunity. Like you got to see people in different lights. You got to experience different kinds of leadership because you always weren't working with the same people. And then at the same time, you got to experience those events. So that was pretty cool. During my time at Bayswater, I also pulled and fired my taser for the very first time, and pretty much the only time in my career that I ever fired one of my weapons. It was at a suspect wielding a tomahawk in the middle of a street one early Sunday morning in a drug-fueled rage. And my partner had pulled his firearm. The other officer that was also present pulled their firearm, and I'm like, oh, this could end badly. So I did not pull my firearm. I actually chose to pull my taser, and I ended up having to taser the person. Now, it wasn't a perfect hit. One of the pins from the taser did not lodge. However, the other one did. It made her drop the axe, which meant that she could be arrested at the time. And that was a pretty scary thing, because when it's life or death, even though I didn't have my firearm, it was one of those situations where life kind of flashes before you. You're like, this could go one of two ways. And I was so grateful that in that moment that I did actually pull my taser and I was able to disarm the offender, because I would never have wanted one of my colleagues to fire their firearm in that situation. Like, we were extremely lucky that, she was able to be disarmed in a relatively easy manner. So that was hard, because then you had to go back, you have to do all the paperwork that follows up, you kind of go through this whirlwind of emotions and adrenaline rush, and yeah, that's an event that does stick out. Another one that also comes to mind is I didn't have to taser that night. It was actually my sergeant, but somebody in a drug-fueled rage, quite violent. It was a very hard situation, and we end up having to try to get this person to show themselves, because they'd hidden themselves, and we had no access to the location where he was. And there was multiple people there that night, and I was calling out, and I remember hearing my sergeant say, "Everybody else shut up and let Trudy speak." And I think it was my mother voice that was coming out, that I would just had this almost stern, severe, do as you're told kind of attitude, but at the same time, this almost calming, underlying calming nature that actually had this guy comply and show himself. So I was the mediator, negotiator that had this person come out, but when he did come out, he did try to go us, so hence my sergeant had to taser him, and that wasn't very fun. I also had another shift where it was probably my first really long shift, in the sense that sometimes you work 10-hour shifts, you'd get a little bit of overtime, no big deal. But I ended up doing this 20-plus hour shift because we'd been called to a job, me and a colleague, right before we knocked off at 2 a.m. And it was to assist some detectives that needed a female for a search. So within the agency, in most situations, it will be a male searching a male or a female searching a female. So there weren't too many females on duty at the time, and I was the closest one. So I was called to go and do a strip search of this female. And as it was, we were looking for drugs, and we did have a small find on her. However, the detectives believed that she had been involved in a buy and that there were considerably more drugs involved. And what that ended up requiring was us getting a personal warrant to be able to search her person in an intrusive manner, which meant a trip to the hospital. And all I'm going to say about that particular job is that it took me and a security guard, a doctor and a nurse for her to give up the package that she was concealing. And that was probably one of the most intrusive, weird, disgusting situations I've ever had to be in. My colleague was doing exactly the same thing for the other male that was also involved. And it was just it was another one of those situations where you're just like, I have no clue what goes on in the underworld, and just going through that process and having to see somebody at their most vulnerable, but at the same time, like, not willing to give it up. Like, they were going, like, fighting tooth and nail to not disclose what they had, and yet it took that to get it from them, which was, yeah, a very different experience, to say the least. I also remember a siege type situation where a colleague and I were called to a welfare check. So this person was considered to be unsafe in the fact that they were considering suicidal thoughts. And so we needed to go and check on this person, make sure they were okay. Anyway, this person ended up holding themselves up in their house, but because we could not get inside or get to this person, and this person was armed, we could not get inside. We could not see if he had anybody else inside. We were in a very, horrible situation. It was boiling hot outside, because I remember we had to stay out for the whole time. We ended up having negotiators come in, 2 of them, because they weren't responding to the first one, so they called in a second one. And then it ended up being the TRG that actually had to go into the house and enter the house and remove that person. And I remember he was also tasered, and I was responsible for removing the pins from the taser. So that wasn't very fun either, like giving first aid to somebody who had been tasered. But yeah, that was a really tough situation, mentally, physically, emotionally. We were standing outside all day in the heat. Me and my colleague couldn't leave the situation because we were the first responders. We had all the details from the get-go. And it was a really long, arduous job. And it was a tough one, especially when we went inside later and found that he had multiple setups for taking his own life. So very, very scary situation. Another incident that I had to deal with that was pretty tough is that I was the first on scene for quite a serious sex assault, and I was the only female in the 2 vehicles that were called. It was me and a colleague and another vehicle with 2 male colleagues. And so being the only female, I attended to the female victim, and having to sit there and listen to this young woman who was not much different in age to my own daughter tell me firsthand what had gone on was gut-wrenching. Like, it was so hard to remain composed, focus on the job, and get the information required from her. Now, my training that I did on the project in reading all those different incident reports really helped me get as much information as I could, because we're not trained to deal with that kind of situation. You always hand that off. And as it was for this job, we handed off to sex assault detectives, and they're trained to do this type of questioning and interviewing. And because I was the first responder, I was just like, I need to get as much information here to help them go to where they need to go next. And so as it was, I asked for feedback on because everything was taken on body-worn camera, which helped the detectives because they were then able to view that footage before they continued and before they interviewed her again, so that they had some basic knowledge. And I was told that I did really, really well for that particular interview. I was also given some critical feedback, which I knew would help me for the next time, if there ever was going to be a next time, to attend that kind of situation. But it was good to know that everything I'd learnt on the project was actually now helping me in my everyday policing career. I then was involved in another sort of arduous situation where me and my sergeant and another colleague went to arrest somebody for a breach of violence restraining order. And I'd had previous dealings with this particular couple. I knew that there were children involved. I knew the home. I knew a lot about the situation. So I was kind of given the lead role because my sergeant and the other colleague weren't as familiar. And so I knew kind of what to expect when I got there. And as it was, we went in, the person was there, we said that they were under arrest, and they wanted to go into another, or they disappeared into another room. And when we got into that room to make sure he wasn't escaping out the window, or to make sure he was getting ready to go, he turned around and pulled a shiv on us. And now a shiv is a piece of metal normally. It can be wood, but in most cases it's metal, that's been filed to a sharp point. And this was probably, the base of it was in his hand, but the point was long enough and shiny enough that that's what I remember seeing, like in his hand. And it all happened in such a split second, but I remember him turning with it in his fist and almost he didn't do a full lunge to me, but he was almost in this stance that one lunge forward, he would have got me. Like he could have, literally my vest wouldn't have covered me in that particular instance. And in that split second, my sergeant literally pushed me back, drew his firearm, pressed the switch on his radio to get radio coverage, and was like, drop the knife, drop the knife. And I drew my taser because I was like, I don't want another firearm here. Like, get my taser ready to go. And in that split second, his partner came between us. And so when obviously there's a civilian involved in a situation like that, we drop our firearm, drop our taser, like we don't point it at anybody. And the female came between us and managed to disarm him and threw the shiv on the bed and was like, stop it, just let them do their job. And I'll be forever grateful for her because things could have turned really nasty. But that was also the first time I was involved in a situation where priority 2 is what police drive to in a highly volatile situation. That's what we're given. Priority 1 is when one of our own or somebody's life is in danger, literally. And that pressing of the Prezel switch on the radio had multiple cars coming to our vicinity, like straight away. Like before I knew it, there were all these coppers there and I'm like, where did you all come from? But it was that instant that radio message was broadcast to all the cars going, drop the knife, drop the knife. We knew that we're in a volatile situation. Now, that last particular incident, I again, had to fill out all the paperwork involved. I had to, go through the use of weapon report and fill out the incident report. At the time, before I could even go back to the station, I had to provide crisis care for the female and her children. So I had to make sure I did all of that. But looking back, apart from a quick, oh, you okay, from the sergeant, and we had changed sergeant, so this was not the original sergeant I had on my team. He'd moved on to a detective sergeant role, and I now had a new sergeant. And apart from him saying, are you okay, that was the only kind of feedback that I got to make sure that I was okay. Like there was no welfare check, there was no follow-up. And I think that's where maybe my PTS started, because that attack, that potential for that attack was such a close call, but you're told to get on with it. It's part of the job. You're okay. Nothing happened. But that's not what your brain does. Your brain goes into overdrive. The cortisol and the adrenaline dumping is huge. And I remember that was the second knife attack for me, because don't forget one happened when I was at Northwest Metro Response. So this was the second time, but in a more confined space, a sharper implement, a more stressed out, aggressive suspect, that I was like, whoa, that was a close call. This is fucking tough. This is my safety. I want to go home to my children. It's a really tough call. So when I think back on it now, is where probably the things started to unravel a little bit. I wasn't feeling totally safe at all times on the job, even though I knew my team had my back. The one thing I never doubted during my time at Bayswater was how much my team had my back. They were my go-to, and to this day, I'm still friends with one of the people on my team. He is my mate who always had my back. So overall, my time at Bayswater, I had an absolute ball. I learnt so much. There are way more positive memories than there are negative ones. I got a really good friend out of it. I had some amazing times. And every time I go to Perth and I happen to be driving in and around that old district, little memories will pop up at me for different reasons. Like I'll remember different jobs. I'll remember, priority driving down certain streets. I will remember certain addresses as I happen to drive past them. Like I don't think I would be alone in that. I think every cop would probably have those feelings, but it's one of those areas that I happen to still visit on a regular basis. Even my time at Northwest Metro Response is probably the same. There's certain streets I drive down and certain addresses that I drive past still, just as part of living my everyday life, that I'm like, oh, I remember that job happened there, or this happened over here. And some of those are good, some of those are fun, some of those are not so great. But it's all part and parcel of policing. And yeah, my time at Bayswater was a good one, and it definitely shaped my policing career. Thank you for tuning in to the Everyday Warriors podcast. If you have an idea for a future episode or a story you'd like to share yourself, then please message me, as I am always up for real, raw, and authentic conversations with other everyday warriors. If you love what you are hearing, please be sure to subscribe and hear all the latest episodes, and spread word to your family, friends and colleagues so they can listen in too. If you are sharing on social media, please be sure to tag me at _Trudy_Marie_ so I can personally acknowledge you. I am always open to comment about how these episodes have resonated with you, the listener. It would also mean the world to me if you were to leave a 5-star review to ensure that the Everyday Warrior podcast is heard by more listeners around the world. And remember, lead with love as you live this one wild and precious life.